Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your patience with our technology. My name is Janine Kitson, and I'm an independent radio. Welcome to this webinar. It's an important one. We have Professor Ove Ogelberg, one of the world's leading scientists on climate and the Great Barrier Reef. I would like to begin by paying my respects to the Darramaragal, Darug and Guringai people on whose land I meet tonight and to their elders past, present and future. I also make the note that the climate crisis is having devastating consequences for our First Nations people. Many live on coastlines or on islands along the Great Barrier Reef and are very vulnerable to rising sea levels, cyclones, coastal erosion, and the loss of marine life, and that means loss of fishing because of warming oceans, coral bleaching, and ocean acidification. So tonight, let me outline the program very quickly. First, we will have acclaimed artist Pamela Griffith, who will share her exquisite artwork on the Great Barrier Reef. Professor Ogelberg will follow and speak on the challenges of our times, and that is saving our Great Barrier Reef, and indeed, saving the planet. Then we will have a Q&A, and then I'll just finish with some concluding words. So let's begin. And we're going to begin with Pamela Griffith, who's an acclaimed artist. Much of Pamela's artwork is about the beauty of the Australian landscape. It's bushland, it's gardens, it's wildlife. But Pamela has also painted and sketched many different aspects of the Great Barrier Reef, which she's going to share with us now. So it's my pleasure to welcome Pamela Griffith.
I'm just hoping that you'll all have a look at the studio in the background where I'm sitting in my studio where I work every day. You'll see a portrait over my shoulder. On the wall, you'll see some paintings I did of the Galapagos. And I have been traveling the Pacific for many, many years. And while there, visiting many small islands, and I've swum on many reefs and depicted the animals, the creatures of the reef. But I have to say that our Great Barrier Reef, 2,300 kilometres of it, ending round about where Lord Howe Island is, has been one of my great loves, and I've visited it regularly. And sadly, in these regular visits, while swimming on the reef, I've seen more and more white coral, more and more bleaching, and the gradual deterioration of it. My work is designed to make people enjoy the reef, but at the same time to respect it. It's the greatest natural wonder of the southern seas. It's a vast maze of islands, reefs and passages supporting a delicately balanced, complex and beautiful ecological system that equals any of the world's great regions of fauna. We are so lucky to have easy access to it, and we really should protect it. It is a silent world when you're swimming there, a world of teeming with the strange life of predators and victims of tiny but sophisticated animal mechanisms. And I try to depict that, the spectacular corals, the reef shells, exotic tropical fish and multitudinous bird life. And I do this because I'm hoping that it will draw people's attention to what we have and how we must protect it and not lose it. I really feel that artists can't do much to save the planet, but they can draw attention to the beauty of the planet and remind people that we have a custodianship that we really have to carry out. These are all etchings. I have another studio downstairs that has a huge etching press, and that's where I printed these works. I love turtles and tortoises, so I have lots of other reptiles as well. So I often work in those, and with etching, it's a very precise art. And what I'm known for is having invented ways of producing coloured etchings. Back in the 1930s, everything was black and white, if you think of the Norman and Lionel Lindsay prints. But I developed techniques where I'm able to, using one or two plates and some hand tinting, and certainly inking up a la Pipet, I've been able to capture the flowing water and the movement and shapes, because that's what you're conscious of when you're diving. You see a gentle movement all the time, and perspective seems to be blunt. You don't see very far into the water. What you see are beautiful shadows and light coming through the water. All of these belong to a period when I was concentrating on the reef, but in more recent years, I've concentrated on wetlands, and the wetlands have been a key to keeping the reef healthy. And we have to work hard to make sure that people do keep the wetlands in good condition. I've seen the crown of thorns starfish at AIMS, which is the centre for this type of research. And I've read the reports about oil drilling and spillage, the dumping of silt into the clear coastal waters, and of course tourism, and the many small devastating things done by single and thoughtless people. And I'm just hoping that we can concentrate on education, educate the public to do the right thing and to save this wonderful wonder.
Thank you, Pamela. Isn't Pamela's artwork just so beautiful in its detail and seeing the wonderful, marvelous marine life? So I just find it very inspiring and intensely empathic to nature. So when we finish, you can stay a little bit longer and we can re-watch those lovely images and we can set to music. So stay with us if you can. Now it is my great pleasure and honour to introduce Professor Ove Ogelberg, Professor of Marine Studies at the University of Queensland. Ove is one of the world's most influential scientists on climate and the Great Barrier Reef. He is a global leader on the solutions needed to address the climate emergency. Welcome, Ove.
Thank you very much, Janine. And I'll just get the computer set up here. Make sure I have the right slide on the screen. Can everybody see that? Right. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much, Janine. I'd like to also recognise the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and to recognise their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to register the privilege that I have of living on Turrbal Jagera country in Brisbane. I have the good fortune of living and working around that area for the last 20 or so years. And of course, it's really great to be here tonight with everyone and to discuss a favourite topic, one of great concern, but one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And what I thought I'd begin with is just really to sort of introduce this amazing system, explain a little bit about how it works and about the threats that it currently faces and how we've got to do a lot more, I think, to preserve it for the future. And the first thing to realize about the Great Barrier Reef, it's one of the few visible signs of life on our planet. And it's 2,300 kilometers long. This is a picture from space. And you can see it's an intricate system. But within that system, there is enormous life. And of course, there's enormous peril now. And so what I want to talk about tonight is to talk about the value of the Great Barrier Reef, about the local and global threats and whether they're significant or is the reef unsafe. And then invariably to move down the pathway of recognizing the fact that the Great Barrier Reef is changing and that we need to do a lot more to solve it. And one of those potential opportunities as we drive to zero carbon as quickly as possible is that there are large refugia in terms of temperature and other climate factors. And it's these refugia that hold some real possibilities for a way forward. And then I'll talk a little bit about a national non-government NGO that we've put together that's recognising this problem and now starting to activate on a global scale. And of course, I'll register by saying we really are at a code red for reef. The Secretary General of the UN pointed out that the Earth is in a similar position. Well, I think that's pretty apt for the Great Barrier Reef. Well, it's one of the best and the best managed reefs in the world. It's home to hundreds of thousands of species. It's one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on the planet. And in terms of tangible benefits to Australia, it brings in about $5 to $6 billion each year from tourism and fisheries. And of course, the COVID virus has caused a downturn through the tourism but normally it's around $5 to $6 billion, providing 63,000 largely sustainable jobs up and down the coastline. And it was recognised to be so valuable that it was made the largest marine park in 1975, and then in tune with its unique values and value to humans across the planet as a World Heritage Zone in 1981. And on the right-hand side there, you see a map, and that map has not only the reef, as you might recognise it, beneath the waters along the coastline, but it also includes the catchments, and that'll turn out to be quite important in this story, because it's that connection from land to sea and the degradation of that land to sea connection that is causing a lot of problems. Not all of the problems, but a lot of the problems. So we've got $5 to $6 billion years, $5 to $6 billion per normal year. It's, you know, the tangible value there is really important. But of course, we've got to recognise you can't slap a number on something so beautiful and so quintessential as the Great Barrier Reef. These systems are sort of invaluable. It's almost unthinkable that the Great Barrier Reef should disappear. But anyway, given all this value and so on, so you'd think we were taking big steps to protect the Great Barrier Reef from the impacts of humans. Well, unfortunately, the Great Barrier Reef has been threatened by local and global factors. And one of the first impacts that occurred, and one that's very big today, is that European farming methods were introduced into the landscape of Queensland. And the resulting deforestation, soil erosion, driven by either forestry or hard-hoofed cattle, caused a big downturn in the near-water reefs on the Great Barrier Reef. And so starting from about 1840s onwards, within a few decades of the arrival of these farmers and their farming techniques, not to denigrate them, of course, but within 20 or 30 years of arriving, the landscape had changed dramatically. What were sort of heavily forested coastal regions became impoverished in terms of soils and so on. And of course, a huge amount of that sediment was flowing out to the sea. And this is just a picture along the coastline. What you're seeing there is a typical river in flood, where all the soil's being washed out to sea. Now, that wasn't always the case. And when you had healthy tree populations in Queensland and the catchments into which the rain falls and trickles down to the coastal regions, all of those catchments were quite clear in terms of the water. So it's only been the introduction of mud and pollutants and so on that has had this effect. And of course, as that muddy water flowed out onto the local coastlines, you start to see sort of big ecological changes, the loss of branching corals, the increase in seaweed, the loss of sort of many of the sort of charismatic megafauna like dugong and so on that depended on those, much of the seagrass beds and so on. So as a result, the sort of coastal reefs of the Great Barrier Reef have declined over time. And at the same time, particularly after World War II, when there were big advances in fishing equipment and people could own a boat and go way offshore and start to fish, there was also the loss of critical species, apex predators, sharks, fish, and a lot of these organisms, like, for example, the fish in that picture there, which is a parrotfish, many of these organisms that were being removed from the reef had a function which they used to produce. And in this case, this is really a grazer, a fish that eats seaweed, and because of its presence, manages to sort of allow the corals to eke through what would otherwise be quickly overgrown by seaweeds. And so we started to change the entire system. This, of course, in the 70s and 80s and eventually into the 90s, grew as increasing pressure on those managing the coastal area of Queensland to sort of recognise that we'd got it wrong, that we needed to look at the long term, we needed to take steps to reduce these problems. And of course, one of the big steps that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority took was to recognize these problems and then to sort of militate for a much greater amount of the Great Barrier Reef protected in things like the marine park up and down the coastline. And so on the left-hand side there, you can see the green areas are the total no-take areas. And in 2004, unanimous parliamentary decree, I guess you'd say, or at least a movement to change the amount protected, led to 34% of the Great Barrier Reef being placed in no-take zones. Now, what's important about this is that that's a really important step in itself. But it's also a multi-use park, meaning that the green areas may have no fishing, but there are other areas such as the blue where commercial fishing is allowed. And this has become quite an exemplar. So it's one of the best managed reef systems in the world. So you might think, okay, we've put in all this, we've started to deal with the coastal problems. We've now slapped down some marine parks and so on. You think, well, we've got the problem solved. We can go off into the sunset feeling pretty self-satisfied. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. And what I need to now talk about is the global threat of climate change and the very strong evidence that we are facing the demise of reefs, not only the Great Barrier Reef, but in fact across the planet. Now, most people recognize coral bleaching because it's been a lot in the newspapers recently, especially over the last 5 years. And basically it's a situation where corals go from a brown color, which is when they're feeling healthy and they've got normal concentrations of tiny algae in their cells, these things called zooxanthellae that essentially make the animal become a plant, get tossed out. And if it's warm enough for long enough, the corals eventually start to die. And so these corals in this photograph that are beautiful sort of shades of pink and blue and white are all really feeling bad at this point. And the first really big event on the reef was in 1998, 99, when 50% of the reef bleached in the shallows and about 10% of the Great Barrier Reef died. And given the Great Barrier Reef is this huge ecosystem, 10% is a very significant number. And when we look behind the reasons for this, and this is a graph showing the length of marine heat waves, it was found that the reason why corals were sort of suddenly bleaching was that it became too warm for too long, that it was just enough to take, if you took the temperatures from sort of 1 to 2 degrees above the summer maxima for about 4 to 6 weeks, you get the conditions where you have heat waves that are then eventually bleach and kill the corals. What we've been seeing, as this graph shows, is this steady increase in the length of those marine heat waves. Now, if you thought that was bad, about 5 years ago, we experienced a really large marine heat wave that affected almost half of the Great Barrier Reef. If you look at that panel that says 2016, you can see that a large part of it is red and a large part of it is green. And that's, of course, over the thousands of kilometers of the Great Barrier Reef. In the left-hand side is a picture of the corals beginning to bleach and die. And this was literally over very large areas, and of course, of the Great Barrier Reef. And this change led to around about 30% of the corals in the shallows of the Great Barrier Reef dying. Now, what was remarkable about this event was that it happened again in the next year. Many of us have been predicting this should happen, where we would have, 2 bleaching events in 2 years, that the frequency would get up to the point where we'd eventually get to having a bleaching event every year. And in fact, that's what happened. In 2017, we had another big bleaching event, which affected a slightly different part of the reef. Another 20% died. And then in 2020, more or less in the southern Great Barrier Reef, we had another 20% died. And it was these 3 events in 5 years, which really caused many to stand up and be noticed. Now, coral cover, which is the amount of coral you find on a reef, is a measure of how healthy and abundant those coral populations are. And so for a long time, we were seeing events, if you looked at, for example, the 2 events in 2016 and 17, you can see this appreciable drop in the northern sector of the Great Barrier Reef corals. But of course, one of the other things about corals is that they might be sensitive to temperature, but they're also very good at recovering. And so if you looked at the amount of coral in the northern sector in the years following 2017, you saw a big uptick in terms of those populations. And of course, some might say, oh, problem solved, we've got through the worst and it's all recovering. The problem is that we are seeing an increased frequency, as I just indicated, in terms of these heat waves, and they're having more and more frequent impacts on coral reefs. So we've had a cool couple of years with La Nina, which is the weather system that to determine some of the variability in temperatures on the reef. And so that we saw this increase in coral temperature. But of course, it differs largely in, sorry, I thought it had fallen over. It's really highly variable around the reef. Some parts of the reef get affected in different bleaching events, as we saw in those graphics where you saw those red dots in different places in different years. You also see the effect of impacts on things like the ability of corals to reproduce. And overall, you see a highly variable system. But what we are seeing more and more of is that coral populations are beginning to sort of get into a tailspin. And so when you look at these numbers that come from hundreds of studies, each one of those dots is a study zone, you start to see a pattern where corals are not looking too healthy. Now, of course, I don't really have the time to talk about all the other things that climate change does to the Great Barrier Reef. What I thought I'd talk about now would be a little bit of the sort of hopeful scenarios of the future if we get our act together and drive greenhouse gases down to zero as quickly as possible. This is a graph of showing simulation of temperature on the Great Barrier Reef in the southern, central and northern regions. And it's a model which was running on a doubling of CO2. And so what you see here is you go from 1860, you keep below that line. That line is the sensitivity of corals. That line is essentially the point at which corals begin to bleach and die. And so as you look at this figure here, over time, as you get into the 2030s, 2040s, you start to see a lot more incursions of corals above that line. And that's what's determining this sort of death and destruction. And of course, when you put all of those things together, those factors I haven't talked about in terms of storms and acidification and so on, and you look at what's likely to happen to the reef over the next 50 to 100 years, it goes something like this. And this is sort of really based on 2 degrees of warming. And what you see is that by the time you get to 2100 on the right-hand side, you've lost 99% of your corals. So on the left-hand side, we've got more or less what we see today, which is a sort of abundant coral populations that in some places, not in others, some reefs are destroyed. A sort of a transition as you go through 2050, as temperatures continue to increase to those in 2100 where we're well above 2 degrees Celsius, and you start to see the death of corals, the erosion of reefs, and a very different ecosystem. And it's not a Great Barrier Reef anymore. Of course, if you then ask, well, what will happen at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is an important number coming out of the Paris Agreement, what was, I think, shocking in the IPCC report that many of us worked on post that assessment, is that 70 to 90% of corals are likely to, that are here on the reefs today, right? So 70 to 90% of corals on reefs today will disappear by 2100. That's leaving 10 to 30% of corals behind. And if you get to that 2 degree level that we just saw sort of simulations of, you do dwindle to less than 1% of today's coral population surviving. So you might say, well, yeah, let's all give up. I mean, we're losing the fight. But I think it's very much a case of concentrating on the 10% we've saved as opposed to the 90% that we lost, that we will lose. And in fact, it turns out that that makes for a particular solution, which we've been putting into play now in various places in the world. I'll talk a little bit about Refugia and then I'll finish up and hopefully we can have some useful discussion. So one of the observations that's been made by a number of different research teams is the fact that not all parts of the ocean are increasing in temperature or in storm activity as other places. So in a way, they become refugia. They're places for corals to hide while we see the worst of climate change. And so it's this idea that then led to the thought that this could be an opportunity. And so it really is a two-step plan. The first thing we've got to do is to aggressively bring greenhouse gas emissions to zero as quickly as possible. Every small delay we have costs us sort of millions of dollars. Once you do that, you get a stabilized ocean, at which point it's important to then identify where those corals are that are least exposed to climate change. And that's what you see in this figure here, which is done for two different amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, RCP 2.6 and RCP 4.5. And essentially what this has done, it's taken the 55,000 5 by 5 kilometer pixels, each of those dots, and it's assessed them for whether they're exposed to a lot of climate change stress or not. And what it turns out, what's really interesting about this is that not all parts of the ocean are heating up or experiencing changing changing cyclones and strength and so on. And so when you look at Japan, for example, that's a place which is not very much of a refuge because things are heating up really quickly and typhoons are becoming stronger in that region. And so coral reefs sort of really cop it. On the other hand, in Indonesia, you've got lots of areas that are dark blue and light blue, and to a large amount are not changing very rapidly as the global temperature and global environment changes. And it's this difference that turns out to be the future of reefs. And that is that if we can identify these regions after having put the skids on greenhouse gas emissions, we end up with sites that are very important to the repopulation of reefs once we've, as I said, decreased the stress of climate change. Those become the target sites for conservation to help coral reefs through to the future. And of course, with that comes, sort of 500 million people who are largely dependent on coral reefs for their food and livelihoods. And we've developed this and written papers like scientists do. But more importantly, we took the work of these experts. And these are this bridge in Hawaii, which has these individuals that were working on the project, are some of the finest sort of coral and oceanography experts. And because it's very much a case of, we've now identified 50 sites across the planet that are least exposed to climate change. We've clustered these so that they're quite large, so they're about 500 square kilometers. And these become the sort of focal points of a number of sites throughout the world, which we need to now focus in on and reduce the non-climate stresses, such as pollution and overfishing, which we talked about in the beginning. And this is a partnership that's grown across the planet. It now has 7 countries involved. This is the Fijian chapter, where we've been discussing where the opportunities are, and the Great Sea Reef in Fiji turns out to be relatively less exposed to climate change and an ideal candidate for cleaning up the problems that are non-climate related, so that these things can survive to repopulate reefs post flattening the climate. So I think I'll finish there. I always like to show this simulation. It's basically 10 years of satellite data that measures chlorophyll, which is the basis of life on the planet. And it's really fascinating to see how dynamic the ocean is. But of course, one of the most amazing things is we've got to not forget that we are an ocean planet, not a land planet, that 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by the ocean and drives what we see around us. Anyway, I think I'll leave there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ove, for that wonderful presentation, which really demonstrates the immense knowledge, your expertise, and so importantly, your passion for saving the Great Barrier Reef.
Thank you very much, Janine. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here tonight and to meet everyone. It's great. Thank you.
And, thank you, Pamela, too, for your beautiful artwork, which I've got one of your art prints on my back of my screen. And I wanted to say why art is so important, because that touches our heart, creativity, and our imagination. And if we have those, it is a very powerful force. And so thank you. We had a bit of question time. Would you like to ask a question about it?
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Thanks very much, Ove. Sorry about the technicalities, but there we go.
I think it was the most challenging talk I've ever given.
You painted
Such a friendly crowd.
Dude, you painted a pretty difficult picture, but I mean, we get a whole lot of continual comments in the conservative media about the fact that the problem is nowhere near as great as the experts are telling us. I mean, the Australian, particularly with Peter Ridd, has been continually commenting on it. On the other hand, you've also got, our Environment Minister, Suzanne Ley, who's doing everything possible, going to quite extraordinary lengths to convince the world the reef is not in danger. What do you really make of all of this? I mean, why do you think this is going on? Where's it coming from? Because I guess your picture is very different.
Well, I think there are, influencers who are in the ear of that particular party, I would imagine. And so that's no surprise to anyone. But I think what happens in all of this sort of rumble tumble of sort of politics and so on, I think scientists have to remain steadfast in terms of calling it as it is. And I'll give you one example. With the UNESCO decision in 2011, I looked at the evidence, and there was massive proliferation of wharves that were sort of shipping coal out to the world. There was an infringement on the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park by gasification facility and so on. And then 50% of the reef had disappeared since the early 1980s. But at that point in time, if we had gone and said the reef is in danger, we would have lost some sort of clout, because we would have lost the stick to poke people with, right? So that was, avoiding in danger listing would have compelled governments to do things, and as it did, it did. And so, I ended up saying, okay, no, I don't think it is. We just should see how the governments respond, both state and federal. 8 years later, of course, according to Susan Ley, there was a broadside by the chair of the World Heritage Committee. And of course, the question came up again about, was the reef, worthy of putting on the endangered listing? And after a little bit of cogitation, I said, no, I think it is now ready. The 8 years of investment, albeit quite a lot of money going into fixing the reef, has only caused the reef to go from a poor condition to a very poor condition in much of its sort of inland area, coastal regions. And it was also very clear that there was no one was dealing with the emissions issue. And again, this is a victim of that particular change, anthropogenic change. So at that point, I said, yeah, no, it is endangered. It should go on the endangered listing. Now, as it is, if you probably recall, it's now got another 6 months for two governments to go back to Paris and to the World Heritage Committee and provide evidence that they are taking this seriously, that they are having you know, success in turning the misfortune of the reef around. Now, interestingly, the La Nina that's caused the coral to grow back, it will be used by the Reds and by the politicians who want it this way, I should say Susan Ley and co. They will use that as, you know, saying that it's all due to them, when in fact it couldn't be and it isn't. But this is the politics of, you know, geopolitics, coral politics and so on. So it's really an interesting area. But I mean, that to me is science has to, all of that aside, just has to stand firm and make sure that the knowledge, the information doesn't get lost in the willy-willy of discussion.
Hi, it's Angela Lowe from the University Days. I'm a Brentford voter.
Yeah, that's right. You taught me, so I've got you to blame.
I taught you, but anyway. I've been very concerned about the Barrier Reef for a long time. I've been working as a volunteer at the Australian Museum in Marine Invertebrates, so I see some of the research at first hand, and certainly see the research which is proving that we don't know probably a third of the animals that live there as yet.
Not even that, nowhere near.
Especially when you get down to the minute ones. My question is, what should be the first piece of climate legislation contain when it is put to the new parliament following the federal election? So we have to tell them to stop global warming. To me, it seems obvious that we have to reduce carbon emissions to do that, but how do we get the politicians to agree to that?
Oh, that wasn't in the question I got. The easy bit here is that we should have, I think, the Price Carbon Responsibly Act, the PCR Act.
Right.
Because this is at the heart of everything. You know, the whole energy imbalance and the whole issue of greenhouse gas pollution is one of not having done the arithmetic to include them in the first place. And so we've got to get them in the tent, and we've got to do this now.
Yes.
How you do that, and that's where many prime ministers did. They got it. When you think about Turnbull and Rudd,
yes,
they were advocating for a carbon price of some sort. And of course, people like Abbott were going, a carbon tax, you know. And so it's it's a perilous business, I think, trying to get a carbon price. On the other hand, just got to go to England and places like that where, you know, countries have had it for decades or for a very long period in Europe. This isn't an issue.
Yes.
And so maybe we could learn a lot from our European and potentially other partners.
Well, it seems to me that the carbon tax is at least hitting them in the hip pocket nerve, if they can produce it. And it seems appalling that we're still producing so much coal for the rest of the world when there are alternatives. I've got people who live on properties who are putting enormous solar farms to produce clean energy, but there's a long way to go.
There is, but I mean, I hold hope for a number of reasons. One is that once you get beyond a certain tipping point, things happen really quickly, and we've seen that with solar.
Yes.
You know, that it's still got a way to go, but I remember in COP something in the 90s.
The meeting just froze.
I froze? No, not me. I remember looking at the graph and realizing it was sort of like 0.01% of the total energy use on the world was solar. And then you look some years later and it's a couple of percent. So is that right, Ian? I think it is something like that, isn't it? It's now several percent. And as you go up the S-curve of adoption, you can go through a very rapid change where you can, you know, take heart. But also to kids, because you come from the university sector, I think it's really important to embolden our young with a sense of optimism, you know, not false optimism, but also with the realization that, yes, it's a very tricky situation, there's no doubt about it. But also this is one of the most exciting times to be alive, because there are these big problems to solve. Technology is going, you know, rapidly, exponentially sort of growing. And so, you know, this is an exciting time to be alive. We mustn't get depressed about it. We've just got to get in there and give it a good go. And I think we'll find it's a lot easier than we think. But we have to have consistency of governments. We've got to somehow change, you know, I think the corporates are changing quite rapidly, but your standard conservative politician is being left behind. And we'll
Can I
suffer.
just make a final comment that as far as Janine goes, we live in the most blue ribbon electorate in the entire country, but I'm quite excited at having an independent to vote for to at least give them a fright.
Thank you, Angela. And Ian, your hand is up.
Yeah, could I just make one small
Yeah.
plea? Please, a carbon tax, it's not a carbon tax,
No,
it's a price on carbon. And
yeah, that's why I had it. See, Ian, I had the price carbon responsibly. Sounds very upright.
But that is removed, just so to everybody's clear, that is removing the biggest subsidy that the world has ever seen, which is the fact that you don't pay for the damage caused by climate change. Jenny, you mentioned earlier that we pay subsidies of $10 billion a year.
Yeah, more than the army.
That's direct subsidy. If you take the actual effect of the damage from climate, the IMF estimate that the total amount of subsidy we're currently paying is $63 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry. And we pay something like 42 billion for our defense budget. So we must keep, every time anybody says it's a carbon tax, you have to pick that up and say, no, it's the removal of a subsidy. And it's not intended that we pay it, it's intended that you avoid carbon so you don't pay it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good point.
Thank you.
And it's kept very quiet. I mean, the average person in the street, you could bail up 1,000 of them, have a gun to their head, they wouldn't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's only because of Abbott and Peter Credlin that we've ended up calling it a carbon tax.
Hello, I'm in Warringah. We've done our best. We've got rid of Abbott. We've got the saintly Zali installed, okay?
The saintly Zalis, yes.
All right. Well, any other questions?
Yes,
Yes, Pamela.
How do we feel? Do you feel about the progress that the United States President Biden is making to cut greenhouse pollution? Is he going to reach his targets?
Well, I have been disappointed that he wasn't unleashed with the Green New Deal, which would have been a very different set of circumstances. On the other hand, it depends on the allocation of the funding within the current trillion or so that's been released. And I suppose I'm hopeful, but I would expect it to slip, unfortunately. I mean, just imagine if the Green New Deal had done an AC rule and, you know, it would just been a different world. But we've been seeing extraordinary politics in the United States, which you couldn't make up. You know, imagine telling people that there was a Republican Party that would vote against an impeachment which had so much evidence for it, you know, and that you all voted together and we, you know, damn everyone else. I mean, that to me is, you know, if you read it a couple of decades ago, it would have been seen as a poorly constructed novel, you know, interesting but not plausible.
Yeah.
Anything can happen.
Yes.
All right. Well, look, thank you, everyone. And thank you for everyone's patience with the challenges of our time, which I can assure you that we had a preparation meeting. We put an enormous amount of energy into this, and that's what happens. Things do not go perfectly, which is exactly the scenario that we are on, where things will not go perfectly, but we all must do our utmost to, with good intent, with good science, to continue the addressing the challenges of our time, because we have seen the beauty through Pamela and we've listened to the science from Ove. So thank you again to both of you for that absolutely marvelous explanation of the wonder and the reason why we must continue. And thank you. So thank you very much. And thank you to Wayne for the wonderful technical support, which your patience has been pushed to the limit tonight.
It was calm for the fire in the end.
So I think we should finish there. And I could say more things, but I think we've said enough. And I think we now need to finish. So I would like to thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience. And let's continue the story. I've got more webinars coming up. We've got lots of things to do ahead of us. And now we're going to finish with relooking at Pamela's beautiful artwork,
Oh, that's great.
set to music that really, hopefully, we will hear the music and continue the struggle. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jeannie. Thanks for the
Not all.
invitation. Great to meet everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye, Janine.
Bye,
Ove.
everyone. Thank you for
Thanks,
coming, everyone.
Good to see you, Ian.
Thank you,
Thank
Ove.
you.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Pamela.
Good,
Yep,
thank you.
that was great.
Authorised by Janine Kitson, Suite 1A, Level 2, 802 Pacific Highway, New South Wales, Gordon 2072.